Hi students, welcome to class today. So today we're going to talk about work in the economy. This is going to cover the entirety of the chapter. It's chapter 12, so we've jumped ahead a bit in the class lectures. We're kind of moving around through the book, not necessarily in order, so you kind of want to keep that in mind as you're going through the readings. So today we're going to cover in the chapter, the entire chapter, which covers work in the economy, the sociological perspectives or the theories on it, the problems involving work and the economy, and improving work and the economy. So this is our discussion questions for today. So first we're going to talk about capitalism and its connection to means of production, otherwise known or spoken of as mode of production. So capitalism and its connection to the mode of production, the difference between socialism and democratic socialism, the hallmarks of capitalism, massive economic bailouts and what that means for companies, jobs in the primary sector, secondary sector, and tertiary sector, outsourcing, capital flight, and its impact on the American economy, labor unions from a class conflict perspective, and a few reasons why labor unions have declined over time. And then what does that mean for the average worker today? And then I'm going to ask you to explain the economy from a functionalist perspective, a conflict perspective, and a symbolic interaction perspective. Okay, so let's talk about some terms. Capitalism and means of production. So capitalism is an economic system essentially that means that the mode of production or the means of production are privately owned by, it was supposed to be individuals. Today that's corporations imbued with the rights of individuals. When you say the mode of production or the means of production, that's anything that needs to, that you need to own in order to create and produce goods and services. So that could be land, tools, technology, mineral rights, those type of things. Those are the means of production. That's how you create or produce in a capitalist economy. Socialism is the economic system and the means of production is an economic system where the means of production is owned in groups instead of individually. So instead of one person owning the factory and everybody else is a paid wage labor, socialism is an economic system where all of the people who work in the factory own the factory and therefore benefit from the surplus wealth that's created from that factory. So sometimes you do see a socialist government where they might have government-owned systems like the electric system or the gas company, that kind of thing. And so what that means is it's a democratic socialist state or a democratic socialist country. That means that the property still remains in the hands of individuals. People still individually own things, but the state or the country owns particular industries that are needed by everybody so that everybody could afford it. So the electric company, the gas company, prison systems, schools, those would not be able to be privately owned. And that way, there's no profit that's going into the pocket of one person. So if the electric company has a surplus, the cost of electricity goes down for everybody instead of the cost remaining the same or increasing and the profit increases for that individual person. Okay, so let's talk about capitalism for a second. a gentleman by the name of Adam Smith, of all names. He is, I guess you could say, the father of capitalism or the founder of capitalism. And he envisioned a capitalistic economy where everybody owned the means of production privately. People made society better because they were pursuing profit. It would have latent benefits for workers, for society, and for communities. And that industries, companies, and individuals would be competing directly with each other for profit. So you would have many people who were competing in a capitalistic economy. And you would have a significant lack of intervention for competition. So what we would today call libertarian kind of ideals, where, you know, the government stays out of the way of industries and companies. So our economy is primarily what we would call a tertiary sector economy. And that means that most of us have service jobs. So like myself, teaching's a service job, being a doctor, a nurse, an accountant, clerical work, working as a valet or working as a waiter or waitress, a chef. These are all service industries. So that's the third sector economy. It's based after the secondary and the primary sector economy. So a primary sector economy, the economy takes and uses raw materials. So where the majority of people in the economy, in a primary sector economy, they would do things like farming, coal mining, logging industry, that type of thing. So you would see people pulling raw materials from the earth, essentially, right? So oil drilling, agriculture, fishing, forestry, mining, all of those things are primary sector industries. In today's world, those tend to be the poorest workers of all of the workers throughout the world, what we would call third world nations. One step up from that for workers and working class people is what we would call the secondary sector. So you have more manufacturing industry. Think the Industrial Revolution, if that makes sense. So you would take those primary sector goods, the wood from deforestation, or fish from the fishing industry, or the food from the agriculture industry, and you would move that through the factories and then sell them as goods and services to the public. That's secondary sector. And then, of course, once that's occurred and you've moved past that within a society, the majority of the jobs end up being what we call service jobs. So we don't necessarily trade in tangible goods and services anymore. We tend to trade in our culture, in our society, in our time, in services that are intangible goods. So you go to an accountant so that they can do your taxes. You go to a teacher so they can teach you. You go to a healthcare provider so they can help you when you're sick. That's tertiary sector. So for all of these, one of the key things to keep in mind is that, yes, there might be some farm workers today, but the majority of people today are not farm workers. They don't work in a factory. Most people today have a service job. So since the early 1980s, we have had what has been called capital flight. So companies today, the top 500 companies, they primarily own the majority of industry moving globally throughout the world. And since U.S. workers make on average more than workers in third world nations, they've moved manufacturing companies and service jobs out of the United States. So when a manufacturing company moves their entire plant from the United States to a third world or developing world nation to do things like create clothes, fast fashion, that type of thing, that's called capital flight. When you have companies that outsource their work, like when you have call centers in India or the Philippines, they're not moving their entire industry out. They are just outsourcing their work. So it's not necessarily called capital flight. Between 1990s or early 2000s and 2015, there were millions and millions of jobs that were lost due to outsourcing and capital flight. So if you were in class, we would do a think, pair, share. We would talk a little bit about this. People tend to have a lot of emotional reaction to this. We've been told, right, that if you see somebody of color, if you see somebody who's Hispanic, they're here to steal your jobs. Most jobs aren't stolen from you, but moved out of your area. So in the Rust Belt, in areas like Michigan, where they had a lot of car manufacturing jobs, those were moved by the companies out of the United States into another country where the company has to pay less taxes, pay less to their workers, and not have to deal with secondary with safety regulations. And that way, they increase their profits and they decrease their liability to work. Okay, so let's talk about how we would describe the economy from the three major perspectives: functionalism, conflict theory, and symbolic interaction theory. From a functionalist perspective, work and the economy serve several functions, but on a macro level, you would think about it like you would think about the different parts or components of your body. Every part of your body serves a function, and some might be deemed more important than others, like your heart is more important than your fingernails, but they're all necessary to be happy and healthy as an individual. So from a functionalist perspective, all jobs, individual jobs that people hold, serve a function, and you need all parts of those jobs, all those different types of jobs, in order for the society, for the economy to be functional as a whole. So if you think about it, you need doctors, you need trashmen, you need chefs, you need teachers for a society to be functional as a whole. If you start removing different types of labor, different jobs, then the society will not be functional as a whole. From a conflict perspective, if we're looking at the economy, the conflict perspective always looks at the economy as antagonistic between two groups, the haves and the have-nots, also known as the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. So the bourgeoisie are the 1%, the elite. They own all of the capital, they own all of the wealth, and their interests are in direct antagonistic conflict with the working class, the proletariat. So what's good for the bourgeoisie is not good for the proletariat. What's good for the proletariat is not good for the bourgeoisie. So from a conflict perspective, the economy allows the elite, the bourgeoisie, to maintain control and maintain the collection of wealth in a small group of hands, and to keep the proletariat in their place, to keep them working and striving, but never moving up the social ladder. From a conflict perspective, work is often alienating, and workplace is often a site of harassment, health concerns, safety issues, that type of thing. Compare that to a functionalist perspective, where they look at work as a form of creating value or self-fulfillment as part of your identity. From a conflict perspective, work can often be a disconnect between who you are and what you do. You don't necessarily have a connection to the product you make because you don't own the end result of it. From a symbolic interaction perspective, this is the micro level perspective, right? Functionalism and conflict are macro level. From a symbolic interaction perspective, they're going to focus on social interactions in the workplace. So how employees relate to each other, how people work together, how they perceive their work and the work that other people do. The meaning that is created through work and the meaning that the workforce or the economy creates for all of us in society. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about labor unions. Labor unions had a huge increase in the early 1900s during the Industrial Revolution. At the time, people worked very long hours. We had really high rates of child labor. Workers' conditions were quite poor, pay was quite poor, and workers were often miserable. Men in the United States specifically fought very hard to have the right to unionize. Many men lost their lives, and some people lost their jobs, their livelihoods, and sometimes even their families' lives trying to unionize. By the end of the Civil War and after the Industrial Revolution, we have as many as a quarter of the United States participating in labor unions. So about 30% of all adult male workers worked in, had employment that was also unionized. This helped significantly in regards to reducing child labor, reducing the amount of hours that people worked per day. People in the Industrial Revolution worked approximately 10 to 16 hours a day, so it wasn't uncommon for a child to work 12 to 14 hours a day, 7 days a week, with little safety regulations. What we consider OSHA safety regulations today, that's common among all workers, was unheard of in the early 1900s and prior to union organization. So by the time we hit the 1950s, we have about a quarter of all private sector non-agricultural workers belonging to unions. So unions were fairly strong and they were able to move in the direction of increasing pay, decreasing workers' hours overall, increasing safety regulations and decreasing child labor significantly by the 1950s and 60s. It went from a child starting to work at about age of 5 in the early 1900s to a child probably not starting to work until they're about 16 in the 1950s and 60s. By the time, however, that we reach the modern era or the late 1900s, union membership has dropped from about 30 to 40% to about 15%. It's between 14 and 15%. And then by 2011, it's about 7.2%. So this is largely because of a concerted effort from organizations, businesses, and union busters. You might not have ever heard the term before, but a union buster, they are groups of lawyers, basically, and they have been hired by companies to fight against unionization. And so they have a variety of tactics that they use, and they've been doing this since the 1950s and 60s. They have fought unions legally through policy and through the court systems. They have fought the idea of unionization as good for workers through mass media and social campaigns. And then of course they fight unions on a, what they call like a grassroots efforts directly in companies if a company has workers who are trying to unionize. So overall, when we talk about states or areas that are largely unionized, we find that not only do union workers earn about 14% more than the non-union worker, but it also increases the average wage of everybody who is also not in the union. So if you have enough people who are unionized in a particular industry, it'll bring up the wages for everybody within that industry. Because we have so few union members today in society, we have not seen any real significant increases in pay, and people in large part do not make a living wage. In other words, they don't make a wage where they could afford to both eat and to pay for housing. So we're seeing a decline in both union membership and in pay over time. And we see a difference between what we call right to work states and largely union states. So California is more focused as a union state. Texas would be a good example of a right to work state. So if you have an industry like the construction industry where you have non-union members in one state and you have union members in another state, you can see a significant difference in the pay for the same job for the same type of worker based on whether or not that state is a largely union state or has a higher percentage of unions within that state versus a right to work state. We see in Texas that there are lower wages, higher poverty rates, more people dependent on benefits like SNAP benefits, those types of things, and less adherence to things like worker safety regulations and that type of thing. So overall, what has happened is that unions have declined. There's been a lot less pressure on non-union employers to raise the wages for everybody to match union wages. So we've seen a stagnation in pay or wages for everybody in general. What this is called is a union wage premium. That means that the union workers who have the higher wage, they basically term that a union wage premium. So because of the union wage premium and the decline in non-union workers and because of union busting, we have seen a steady decline since the 1940s through today of the rates of people who work in unions. The decline is not kind of equal across the board. In general, what we tend to see is that decline is much steeper for people of color and for women. So women are less likely to be involved in a union. Men of color are less likely to also have jobs that happen to be involved in a union as well. If you are in a union, you're more likely to be covered by your employer and have paid health insurance. You're more likely to have lower deductibles on your health insurance. You tend to have an increased pay for all workers within your industry, increased safety regulations, and more job security. Because of the decline in union, that means that the average worker today is less likely to have paid health insurance, and they are more likely to have higher premiums and less safety regulations in the job force. Okay, so this is pretty much the end of this chapter. I would recommend that you watch Confessions of a Union Buster. I posted that video on the discussion board by Jay Levitt. He's an actual union buster. And so I posted one video, but he has a series of videos where he talks about all the different strategies. Very interesting. You may have experienced them yourselves. You may have experienced, if you like, for example, worked for TJ Maxx. They have a whole video introduction when they do their training that came directly from an organization that is Union Busters. So you would recognize some of these strategies. And then if you're interested even further, Requiem for the American Dream is also a very good video and book by one of the best known scholars of our time. I hope you enjoyed the lecture and have a great day. Don't forget to do your writing and your discussion.